Svetlana, you wanted the screen control. There you are. How you doing, Ed?
Sorry, I was muted. Hi, how are you? It's good to see you.
Good. Yeah, it's been a while.
It has been. Haven't been anywhere.
Yeah, no kidding.
You're near the San Diego area, correct?
Uh, yeah. We're about a half hour north from downtown.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Nice area.
yeah. So it's nice. It's campus is in a good area. Of course, I'd probably say 90% of the students here actually haven't. Well, maybe not that many, but more than a few of them actually haven't been to campus because we haven't really been doing any in-person classes.
Right. You're still hybrid.
Yeah, so this class, we do have a lab, but because of safety things, it's not as in depth as maybe we would have liked. But
Yeah, I
that's
can imagine the challenges of trying to do lab
yeah,
through this. I've only been to campus about 8 times in the last year. It's just no reason. Everything's gone remote. So, and our studies have been down for a good bit of the time. So there's been no reason to be on campus. But hopefully soon, when you start getting back. You're living in a good area for biking then.
yes, it is. It's a very nice area for biking, but I need to expand my quiver. One one bike doesn't get the job done. But yeah,
So I threw together a couple slides. Is
okay.
that it's to do an intro? Is it because just to give some background? Is that what you'd like to see?
Sure. Yeah, I was just gonna have the students start with their intro of you, and we'll move on from there if that sounds good.
That's fine. I don't even have to dive into those. If they've got enough information from what we talked about last week, that's fine. We can just go right into a Q&A, whatever works best for you.
Right. So yeah, we'll have them do your background, and then we'll just kind of uh, freewheel it from there.
Okay, I see 25 students, 25 participants. Is that about right?
There should be 23, including 25 total, including you and me. Yeah.
I guess we have everybody then.
Yeah. We started about 1 o'clock.
Oh, okay.
I,
So this
so
is a
I usually
continuation.
go over some stuff, and sometimes I do a little kind of pre-talk.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I just kind of went over some of Mike Ormsby's fat metabolism resistance exercise stuff because we haven't really talked about that. But anyway, all right. So Svetlana, if you want to go ahead and we'll do our background intro here.
Yeah, so it will be Svetlana, Julian, and me. They're going to be presenting on Dr. Edward Melanson. Just give me a sec. Yeah, so Dr. Melanson is currently uh, at the University of Colorado, Denver medical campus, where he is the director of the Energy Metabolism Lab that was founded in 2019. And their focus there is to study the energy metabolism and physical activity and how these change in response to things like exercise, diet, weight loss, and sleep. And the lab provides resources to assess energy expenditure using highly controlled conditions with a whole room calorimeter, which is like a whole room, like kind of like a metabolic cart, but it's an entire room, and they're isolated in there, and the whole room gas exchange data from the whole room is collected, among other things. And they also use other more advanced techniques like doubly labeled water, and things like that. So next slide. So yeah, this is an outline. This is what we'll be going over. We'll be going over his education and training, his research interests and activities, publications, and other presentations, both here in the U.S. and out of the country. Over some funding, some awards, some current and past student trainees, and some interesting facts and advice from him. So first, for his education, and you might find a little surprising that he actually got his bachelor's degree in business administration and computer science at Ohio State University in 1980.
Rasmus?
Yes.
You forgot the Ohio State University.
The Ohio State University, right. Yeah. My cat is playing with my stuff under my desk. Well, so after this, when he was at Ohio State, he was a competitive swimmer. And after his degree, he became a programmer or a code monkey, as he describes it. And on the side, he was coaching swimming in the evenings. And that really developed the desire to learn more about the physiology of exercise and performance. And that is really what served as his motivation to apply to the master's program at the University of Massachusetts Department of Exercise Science in 1993. There's like a yellow box on the screen. Am I the only one who sees that?
Yeah, my computer does that. Like I don't, when something like interrupts it.
I was trying to remove it.
Sorry.
Oh, well. Yeah, so when he got accepted to the master's program, his intent was just to learn exercise physiology and become a more competent kind of coach for sports teams, and also maybe be able to teach a little bit at smaller universities. However, when he was in the program, he became more and more interested in the research, and he saw ways that he saw ways in which the field could be improved. He then decided to go on to do a PhD, which he did at the same place, the University of Massachusetts Department of Exercise Science, with his advisor, Patty Friedson. And initially he worked with accelerometers to objectively track physical activity and potentially use that to measure or estimate energy expenditure. And that was really around the time where it became apparent that exercise kind of lightened the burden of chronic disease. And actually for his master's thesis, he did an experiment where they wore a single device in 3 different locations and to see if they could use that output to predict energy expenditure using these accelerometers. And during his PhD, he worked with his advisor, and a paper was published as a result of that, which is known as the Friedson-Cut point equation, and which is a correlation between accelerometer outputs and energy expenditure. And that paper has now been cited over 2,000 times. And that was really one of the main events that advanced the field of physical activity assessment. And then for his PhD dissertation, he worked with heart rate variability and that its correlation to health and training response. And then so after his PhD, he wanted to go more in the direction of metabolism rather than energy expenditure. And that's where he is now today at the University of Colorado, where he did his postdoc. And since then, his research is mostly focused on metabolism and obesity. So next slide. And so these are just his primary research areas. So currently, as I mentioned before, he is at the Division of Endocrinology, Metabolism, Diabetes, and Division of Geriatric Medicine at the medical campus of University of Colorado. And his main research interests there are developing new methods for assessing energy expenditure and physical activity in free living humans, studying the effects of menopause impacts, bioenergetics and metabolism, and also understanding how lifestyle interventions impact physical activity, sedentary behavior, and health outcomes. Next.
All right, so the publications and presentations of Dr. Melanson. Let me see. So total citations of all his publications, I used Google Scholar, and it came out with 9,772 citations. His H index is 48 based on what I used through Google Scholar. And the total amount of publications he did was 119 total, where there was 92 research articles, 20 reviews, 2 letters to the editor, and 5 book chapters. In regards to presentations, if I did the math right, it's 47 presentations he's done. And on an international level, there were 8 presentations, national and local, 11, symposia at national meetings, 13, intramural seminars and grad rounds, 12, and continuing medical education and education talks, 3. So as you can see, he has done a lot of research and is very prominent in the field of exercise physiology. In terms of funding, the grants that are currently active, he has 12 grants that he's currently working on or has in terms of his research. And then the total grants completed since 1996 have been 26. We asked him his top 3 most notable and impactful grants based that helped with his research or influenced his research. And the first one was his KO1 grant, which he had received in 2002 and worked on it till 2006. It was from the National Institute of Health, and it basically the Mentored Research Scientist Development Award. And he said this was very notable because it helped him transition to becoming an independent investigator. It helped him develop research and critical thinking skills, and it helped him learn how to do large-scale research or strengthen his ability to work on large-scale research. And then his second most notable grant was the R01 grant. And R01 grant is from the same NIH, and it's health-related research, and it's an award for the to support the investigator, which is Dr. Melanson, based on his specific interests, which aligns to the missions of NIH. And this is his current project. It'll be finished what month of sometime
August.
this year.
August.
August, yeah. And the impact, it's about the impact of estrogen status on the biological function of brown adipose tissue in women measured using quantitative PET/CT. August. Okay, and then the third impactful grant is the Motor Pack initiative. And Motor Pack stands for Molecular Transducers of Physical Activity Consortium. And this is his colleague, Dr. Court's grant, but he has an affiliation with this grant. And it is funded by NIH, the Common Fund. And it's about the molecular signals via which exercise reduces the risk of chronic disease. And I think there's, it's being conducted over various labs.
All right, and then going on to some of his awards. In the first two, 1997 and 98, he was in his PhD program, and he got the Outstanding Doctoral Student Scholarship Award in New England chapter of American College of Sports Medicine, and the Excellence in Teaching Award, continuing education program, and that was at the University of Massachusetts, where he did his PhD. And in 2002, I believe he was in his postdoc, and he received the National Institute of Health Mentored Research Scientist Development Award. And then more recently, he received the Colorado Nutrition and Obesity Research Center Outstanding Mentor Award. And some of his student trainees, he has 3 current postdocs, and he's also mentored 3 previous postdocs. and he's been involved in 9 mentoring committees, and he currently has one PhD student. And he mentioned when we interviewed him that lack of funding to support more students was kind of the biggest barrier into getting more students to be mentored. And the reason he got the PhD student was actually he had funding from the military. And some of the interesting facts and hobbies. He said anything to do with his two dogs he loves doing. Competed in a few Hawaiian Ironman competitions, which I kind of just found a generic Google picture down on the right. Right now, he's kind of focusing on enjoyment and health in terms of exercise. And he loves skiing as he's in Colorado and there's a bunch of beautiful mountains around him. But he's kind of shifted to cross country skiing due to COVID because he feels it's safer alternative, less people around. And a little bit more, he loves traveling. He mentioned that two of his favorite cities were Amsterdam and Copenhagen. But he likes Amsterdam more because of the Van Gogh Museum, which I have a picture on the bottom right. And he's a huge Ohio State fan, as he mentioned a little bit earlier. And in college, he was a swimmer. And that, like Rasmus said before, kind of pushed him into the career path that he chose.
All right, thank you guys for that thorough and excellent introduction.
It was a little humbling too. I've never looked up my citations, and I think you saw my reaction. I don't know if that's really high or not, but it struck me as being high. So I was a little surprised by that.
Yeah, it seems pretty high to me. I mean, it comes back to this was a discussion I wanted to have with the students a little while ago, but it just kind of never came up. Was this idea of who or whom are we actually publishing research for? You know, are we doing it for us and our ego? Because, or are we doing it for other reasons? Because, like, for the most part, and I'm sorry, guys, that I'm gonna have to say this to you, but you're gonna, if you choose to stay in academia, you're gonna learn this eventually. There's probably only like 10 or 20 people in the world who are actually gonna read your papers. It might be a little bit higher than that, but whatever you publish, it's not going to be like something that's published in Science or Nature, or it's not going to be a paper on CRISPR or something that's going to get you a Nobel Prize. I'm sorry, but that's just how it goes for our field, you know. And so I think, and you probably feel the same way, Ed. And so I think what it comes down to for a lot of us is we want to do research that we personally feel is meaningful and impactful, but can also be translated and applied to broader populations.
Agreed. As you were talking about this, I was thinking about a paper that we were required to read when I was a master's student, and it was called Chaos in the Brickyard. And Priscilla Clarkson had us read it as part of her class on scientific inquiry. And one of the things that we discussed after that paper, it wasn't necessarily the point of the paper, but it kind of came out in that, you know, that all the studies that we do contribute to a body of literature. And so, like, they're all bricks that start to form a wall. And, you know, obviously some papers, some research is going to put more bricks or bigger bricks and bigger foundations, but they all contribute to the base of knowledge in an area. And I think that's a good way to look at your research. Not all of your papers are going to be cited 2,000 times like our paper with Patty was, but hopefully it's work that's contributing to a base of knowledge in an area. And that's what we hope for.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see. So I have in the past kind of let these discussions just kind of free roll and free flow.
It's good with me.
And so I think we'll start off there, but to kind of make the students happy, I want to try to work in some of the papers because the last couple of guest speakers, we haven't really talked about the papers. We've just let the guest speakers just kind of expand upon the questions and whatnot. But that's not to say if we have a good discussion going, then we'll see how we go. But yeah, so I guess so coming out, let's kind of talk about coming out of the PhD and going to Colorado and kind of establishing that line of research. Like, how did you go there? And I mean, I think Jim was already there, I think, right? But how did you establish and build yourself as an investigator?
Patty was pretty influential in me lining up in Colorado. She knew what my interests were, and that I was very happy with the work I was doing, but I knew I didn't want to make it my career. I wanted to go in a different direction, and I was really interested in metabolism from the health perspective, and obviously obesity was a natural extension. So she was pretty instrumental in making the connection with me to Jim. And getting that to Colorado in the first place. So, I owe a lot to Patty just from my career in general. She tells a funny story about, I came to her and I wanted to be in her lab as a master's student, and I was coming in with this degree in business administration. And she was kind of looking at me like, what? And she also did all 3 of her degrees at the University of Michigan. So she says, she'll tell this story now that I'm looking at this guy with no background in science, and he went to Ohio State. And I was like, why do I want to let this guy in my lab? But she said I made a persuasive enough argument that she saw a lot of motivation in me. And that was really the foundation of getting started. So, I owe her an awful lot for just getting me started in science in general and then helping to propel my career. By making that shift and going to a new field and going to a medical center in particular to do my postdoc, really that, I talked about my K being my most influential because it really provided me the time past my initial postdoc experience to really delve into research and develop my own line of research. But being in a medical school, you just start to see the importance of what we do from a different perspective. As was alluded in the intro, I think a lot of us in this field come into it with a sports background, and we don't think too much about the health perspective of what we study and what we're trying to learn. And my eyes were really opened by that. And I think one of the things at the medical school is you start to shift your thinking and you're starting more about pathology of things than you are about performance. And that's really opened my eyes to a lot of the research and guided where I've gone. So I think it's just the exposure of the medical school environment that has just been so intriguing. And, even now, I'm certainly not an expert, but being in a medical school is providing me access to different things related to COVID. And I'm learning more about COVID. I'm not going to become a COVID researcher at this point, but at least I can look and see resources and go to seminars and symposia. And like we had a great one a couple of weeks ago on the vaccines and how they'll do on the variants. So it's that environment has always intrigued me, and it keeps you really motivated. And so much to learn. That's why I've chosen to make my career at an academic medical center. It's not easy, as you know. We rely on soft money. It's all grants, and you got to keep writing grants. But I think definitely the payoffs are there.
So just for the students in academia, I was going to say higher education, but I guess no, the same thing. But depending on where you're at, there's kind of 2 ways that you can support yourself as an academic. If you're at a school like I am, where teaching is your primary responsibility, then normally that'll be the main factor determining your salary is you have to teach X number of classes in order to be full-time. But at a research-heavy institution, such as UCSD or Colorado, where Ed is at, or University of Kansas, where I was for a little while doing my postdoc, most investigators there are what we call soft money funded, which means they're not getting money from the school, they're not getting money from the state. Any money they're getting is coming from grants from the government or from private or industry. So if you have a bad year with grants, things can be kind of grim. Because you're not only getting those grants to support your salary, you're supporting the people in your lab who work with or for you. You're paying for equipment, upkeep, these are all things that you're funding from grants that more teaching focused academics don't have to really concern themselves with. And so it's not to say that one location is necessarily more difficult than the other. There are just differing priorities. But it's, as Ed kind of hinted at, when you're gutting by on soft money, you're pretty much writing grants all the time because grants have a start date and an end date. And generally, if the money isn't spent by the end date, well, I don't know. Do the NIH take money? They don't take anything back, do they? They pretty much, once you get the money,
I
you
w-
can do whatever you want.
Oh, I wish I could say that's the case. So, you'll have a 3, 4, or 5 year grant, and this is fairly typical with clinical research. It's really difficult sometimes to get all that work done in the period of time. Clinical research just takes a long time to run some of these studies. So you can do no cost extensions, and if you haven't spent the money, you can carry it into an additional year or even a second year. The first year is automatic. You don't even have to write anything other than a letter to say I'd like a no cost extension. If you get into the second year, then you have to justify that. So you can extend the funds. You're not getting additional funds. You can just extend it. And that helps you give the time to complete the research. But in terms of cuts, I'm a collaborator on one grant with somebody from the University of Wisconsin, and we're entering the 5th year. And he just notified me on Friday that our budget was cut by about 40% going into the last year. So we're scrambling to figure out how we're going to finish that up. This is the biggest cut I've ever had to deal with on a grant. So we're scrambling. We don't know what we're going to do yet, but we'll figure it out. So yeah, this can happen. You get the award, and you write a budget. You might ask for $500,000 a year. You may only get 400 or 450. So you have to make an adjustment. But the way the grants work too is that you don't get all 5 years at once. You have to submit a progress report at the end of the year, and then they renew your budget for the next year. And there's no guarantee they'll give you the same amount of money that they gave you the first year. I've never dealt with that before. I've always had my full amounts that were promised to me at the start of the grant period. So this is the first time we've ever had to deal with a cut like this. So we'll see what we can figure out. But you also touched on something else that my thinking on this has changed over time too. And early on, my anxiety was about writing grants to support myself. But as my career has progressed, and now I have my own staff and my own lab, it's the anxiety becomes the other way. It's about being able to make sure that you continue to support your staff and you continue to have the funds that you need to build your lab and grow your lab. So the pressure is always there. But if you're doing good science and you're in the right environment, importantly, if you look at my CV, this really comes out. Collaborations are so key to be successful in an environment like this. You can't do it all on your own. Not just from a support perspective, but I think the current project I'm on right now, doing the PET CT work where we're measuring brown fat, it's a great collaboration with investigators from the University of Ottawa and University of Sherbrooke in Canada. We all bring unique aspects, unique perspectives to this project. And it's really in a way a bit of a dream team of what we're studying, and none of us could have done this on our own. And we all bring things to the project that make it a great project, I believe.
Yeah, so I actually want to kind of springboard on that. And I don't remember when we talked about it, guys, but I know we had a relatively brief discussion on brown fat because I think either somebody had a question or I showed something about it, and then it just led to a slightly longer discussion. But maybe could you talk a little bit about what brown fat is, and then maybe why it's something we could consider studying, and what you're hoping to answer with the current project?
Yeah, it's been a fun story of how this has evolved. So being from an exercise physiology background and not having much of a science background until I did my PhD work, I'd never really heard about brown fat. And so when I was a trainee and a postdoc, and I was reading a lot of literature and going to seminars, I started to hear the talk about brown fat. And so brown fat is distinct from what we think about with white fat. So when we think about white fat, it's the big lipid droplet. It stores an awful lot of triglyceride. It used to be considered an inert storage depot where just fat was stored, but we know now that white fat's a lot more than that. It secretes a lot of cytokines and other factors that have effects distally in the body and on metabolism. And it definitely plays a big role in the immune responses as well. But then there's brown fat, which, I think you know probably a little bit of the overview that it's a very different fat, and it probably, pure brown fat comes from a very different lineage of cells, but it's a thermogenic fat, and morphologically how it differs is it has a lot of mitochondria, whereas white fat has very little mitochondria. And in white fat, you'll see the big lipid droplets, but in brown fat, you see these small, little tiny lipid droplets with an extensive network of mitochondria. And the purpose of brown fat is to generate heat. But in the process of doing so, it uses a lot of energy to do that. And where you'll find a lot of brown fat is when is in rodents. This is how they stay warm. You'll find it in hibernating animals. But in terms of humans, when I would ask people, and I bring this up to people who I asked this question 20 years ago, I'd ask about brown fat, and I always get the same response of, no, it's not important. We have a lot of it as an infant, and then as we age, we lose it. We don't have it. It's not important. But the field kind of shifted in 2007. There was 3 papers that were published simultaneously in the New England Journal of Medicine that showed that there is extensive amount of brown fat in some humans, and now the field was just reinvigorated. The brown fat had been discussed a long time ago, but really we didn't have the imaging modalities that we have now to study in humans. And it really reinvigorated the field to try and understand what the importance of brown fat is. And so how I backed into this area of research myself, and why we had the R1 on this, is you saw some of the collaborative work I did with Wendy Court, where she has established a line of research in trying to understand the menopausal transition, because what happens in menopause is there's not just that women will gain weight, but there's a redistribution of body fat. So when women transition through the menopause, become postmenopausal, prior to menopause, if they gain weight, they'll tend to accumulate fat stores in the lower body, in the gluteal and femoral region. But after menopause, they'll accumulate it more in the visceral region, now looking like men with the central fat. And with that, there's an increased risk of chronic disease. So the disease burden goes up when women start to accumulate so fat. The incidence of type 2 diabetes goes up, cardiovascular disease, all the problems that we see with visceral fat go up with this. So Wendy initiated some studies to really try and understand some of the mechanisms behind this. And the preclinical data, the data in rodent models, was very suggestive that it was an estrogen-related effect, that it was the lack of estrogen that was promoting the gain in fat mass. But it still wasn't clear how that happened. So we initiated studies here, and we showed that when we reduce suppression of ovarian function in premenopausal women, we could cause dramatic reductions in resting energy expenditure and 24-hour energy expenditure. And particularly the resting energy expenditure, if we added back estradiol, we could reverse that. We could restore the energy expenditure. So it showed that estrogen had some sort of an effect on regulating energy expenditure. And understanding energy expenditure and substrate metabolism as it relates to obesity was right in my area. So I became very excited about it, and I was reading some literature, but I was also still reading the brown fat stuff. And Deb Clegg, she was at Texas Southwest at the time. Her group published a paper, and what they'd done is knocked out the estrogen receptor alpha in 2 different sets of neurons in the hypothalamus. And when they knocked it out once, and when they did that, the mice became fat. But depending on which neurons they knocked it out, it had a different effect. And when they knocked it out in one specific set of neurons, what happened is the mice became fat, and their brown fat almost went away. They lost all their brown fat activity. And it was literally an aha moment, because we were publishing our papers on the energy expenditure, and here I'm reading Deb Clegg's paper on how the hypothalamic estrogen regulation of energy expenditure on brown fat. And so I presented it in our lab meeting, and I remember Wendy just looking over at me at the table saying, we have to do this. And she'd had an interest in brown fat when she was a graduate student at Arizona State. She'd followed Mike Stockwell's work, Stockwell and Roth had published the paper in Nature back in, I think, in the 70s on this topic. But again, we didn't have the imaging modalities then. So we started some pilot work in that area. And as we were performing the pilot studies, a specific request came out from the NIH. So the way the NIH works with funding is you can submit any idea you want. It has to go to the right institute, the right study section, which reviews it. But occasionally the NIH will come out with these, which either called program announcements or requests for applications. And RFAs, the request for applications, are on a specific topic. And the NIDDK, which is the National Institute of Diabetes, Digestive Disease, and Kidney Disease, which is where I get most of my funding, came out with this RFA where they were going to support studies that would start to understand the physiological importance of brown fat in humans. And so we took the preliminary data that we had, the pilot data that we generated, and we used it as preliminary data for the grant. And we were one of the 5 grants that were funded for that. And that's really propelled us in that area. Now, going back to the collaborations, if you don't mind me kind of go off here in another minute, I'd known Francois Hamann, Denis Blondin from University of Ottawa for many years, and they had done just amazing work in the brown fat arena through some novel imaging approaches. And when it came time to do that grant, I was like, we have to go with the best approaches available. And so I approached them and said that this came up, and since they're Canadian, they can't apply for this, but they could go in as co-investigators. And we established the collaboration, and it's really taken off from them. So really capitalizing on a pre-existing relationship and knowing their work and trying to apply the best techniques that we have available to us to study this question. And it's been a great 5 years, a lot of setbacks because of COVID and other things, but it's still been a very great experience. I'm learning a lot. I think we've generated some great data, and I think we're going to do some really good research in this area in the future.
So with the brown fat, I guess, you kind of hit on the dogma, that I'm most familiar with, that being, we have relatively high levels as infants, and then it goes away, or not goes away, but it gets smaller as we get older, and
Right.
the role has always been kind of understated. But is there?
I know where you go in this question, and I know how to answer. What is the importance, right? And I've shifted my thinking to thinking that it's really about the energy expenditure. I don't think that's really what it's about. I don't think we're ever going to come up with treatments like exposing people to cold, activating their brown fat, and helping them lose weight. I don't think that's what we're going to learn from this. I have a different way of thinking about brown fat now. And again, this is the best part of research, is you learn as you go, both from what the data you generate, but from reading in an area. And I think there's a couple of areas that kind of express to me what brown fat's important might be. One is that, just like we've learned with white fat, the initial thinking on white fat was it was just an inert storage depot. That's where the excess fat calories went, and we stored it there, and there's nothing else that happened. We now know that white fat's an endocrine organ. It can secrete many things into the bloodstream that have effects on metabolism, both good and bad. And it's likely that we're going to find out that there's an association. We already know some of this, but I think we'll learn a lot more with COVID. And why is it that obesity is such a risk factor for severe COVID? And I think it's got to do with immune responses that are regulated through white fat. Yeah. But just like white fat, we now know that brown fat secretes things into the circulation that has effects distally on metabolism. Kristen Stanford, who's at the Ohio State University, has done some really cool work demonstrating that this molecule called 12-13-dihome that's released from brown fat. And initially what they showed is it had an autocrine effect, where when it was stimulate brown fat, this was released, and it stimulated the brown fat to take up more lipid so that it had fuel. But she's now shown that 12-13-dihome has effects on fatty acid uptake in cardiac tissue as well as skeletal muscle. So I think there's the bradykine effect. What is BAT secreting that has effects metabolically, and what's good and what's bad. The other thing that I think, it was a paper that I read, you mentioned CRISPR, so that's good. That means your students know a little bit about this. And those of you that know a little bit about brown fat, we have these terms. We have brown fat, what we call BAT. And then there's these intermediate types of cells that are white-like, kind of brown-like. They call them either beige or bright. And so there was this paper, I can't remember the group that did it, but they used CRISPR technology to produce what they called humble BAT cells. And what they were humanized beige cells. And so they used CRISPR to do that, and they transplanted these into mice. And when they did this, they can, do all the things when you study glucose tolerance, insulin resistance, body weight gain on a high fat diet, you could ameliorate all those things. But it wasn't from the humble cells. It was the humble cells being implanted that did something distally to other organs and cells in the body. So like there's this cross communication between tissues that I think is important. And I'm starting to think of brown fat a little bit like, I don't know if your students are familiar with this, but there's lipodystrophic models. So there are a few, it's rare, but you have humans that have no subcutaneous fat. And it's got to do with the genetic defect, and they're called lipodystrophic. You can also induce lipodystrophy in rodent models. And so this is like a complete absence of subcutaneous fat. And in those models, these people are skinny, number one, they're hypermetabolic, but they have severe insulin resistance that you would see in an obese person. So it's like you have to have some to maintain metabolic balance. And I'm starting to think about brown fat in that it's in that same model that you have to have some to maintain overall metabolic health. And if you lose it or it's dysfunctional, then you have poor metabolic health. So I'm starting to think about it a little bit more in a different light. And my focus, I think, is not so much on the energy expenditure piece, like I said, but more about how it is an important organ for overall health. And then, of course, the questions that come from that is, well, how do you maintain brown fat? How do you stimulate brown fat to have those effects? So that's my current thinking in this area. Okay, there's a question. Of some humans with more brown fat, what is it that makes them have more? Great question. We don't know the answer to that. I do have a hypothesis still that female sex hormones and perhaps gonadotropins have an effect. There are a few papers, I was just reading another one that I hadn't seen before, where they've looked at, this one was looking at people that are in Siberia that worked outside. And so these populations that work outside in cold weather, there's evidence that they have more brown fat. So cold is the obvious one. There's a few clinical studies that have shown that people who have really elevated sympathetic nervous system responses from, I forget what it's from, but these are abnormal pathologies. They've been shown in case studies to have huge amounts of brown fat because of this overstimulation of sympathetic activity. But of course, that comes with risk because the sympathetic activity is too high, then you can have abnormal cardiovascular effects with that as well. So we know a few things, but we don't know many. There's been a few dietary factors implicated. I'm not so sure where I stand on that. Green tea has been cited as one that will stimulate brown fat. It might stimulate the activity, but whether it stimulates the growth of brown fat, we don't know. There has been some recent literature that suggests that polyunsaturated fats, particularly omega-3s, may have an effect on brown fat proliferation, but I think there's a lot more to be learned there. So we still don't really understand completely. The one that we do know is cold exposure, and that's through a sympathetically mediated event. So a couple other questions came up in the chat.
Yeah, I think you answered the next one.
Yeah. So that's a great question. The thing about the cold water swimmers, that is a group I definitely want to study because I've been involved with triathlon and masters swimming here in Colorado for many years. And I know several people who have trained to do things such as swim the English Channel or other cold water events. And I think an Ironman's crazy. I think these people that swim in the cold water are really crazy. To get ready to swim in it, because at best on a warm year, the water temperature in the English Channel is about 60 degrees, maybe 62. So you're going to be in cold water for 11 hours or so. So you have to develop that tolerance to it. And what these people do is they start going up into the mountains in like April when the snow is melting and the ice is melting off the lakes, and they start getting in the water up there to acclimate to the cold. And I remember one woman that I know that I was talking to, she was really thin, and not the type of person you would think about that would do these open water events. She was doing it as part of a relay for charity. And the first day they did it, she was in the water for less than 5 minutes, and she spent 3 hours in the car with the heater at full blast until she stopped shivering. But over the next couple of weeks, that shivering response went away. Her body adjusted somehow to that cold to be able to produce the heat and keep her going. And some of it had to have been brown fat. And it's a population I definitely want to study and see what they have.
Yeah, I think that I guess just kind of piggybacking off that, do we have kind of population level data on brown fat? Yeah, I didn't
No,
did.
no, and a lot of it has to do with, the methodology is advanced. We can do a lot more imaging wise, but there's still a lot of limitations with it. And I won't have time to go into it, but we really lack a good mean of actually quantifying brown fat volume in people. We're really hand tied right now because we have to make some assumptions with the techniques that are available to us. And then the question is, how much of what we measure is active versus inactive? So, we don't have those techniques yet, but I imagine that in the future we might. I think that, and I was on a call this morning talking about it, I think that MR, magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, has the potential to maybe help advance this, but it's got a long way to go too.
Yeah, and then of course the problem with all of those is, like you said, they're all imaging, and so you need a hospital or a clinical research center to be able to do that. It's not something.
Oh, the studies we do are so expensive. So just to do one study, the time in the scanner is about $2,400. One of the isotopes I use is $400, and one of the other isotopes is about $2,300. So we're looking at $5,000 to $6,000 just to do one study. It's expensive. It's really expensive.
And that is something to keep in mind, you guys, when you see studies that don't have huge sample sizes. But if they use some of these more sophisticated techniques, the reason the sample size was probably small was because they couldn't afford more subjects to do these measurements. So,
The competing renewal that we put in, it got a good score, but I had to go back in. We were almost at the budget limit, and they came back with a few suggestions of things to add on. I was like, how are you going to pay for this?
so any other things you guys want to ask about brown fat? Otherwise, I want to kind of switch it up and start talking about talk about a little bit about the sex hormones and their role in metabolism. Okay, so we'll move on from brown fat. Now we'll move on to, I guess specifically you focused on the female reproductive hormones, right, and their roles. So I
Mhm.
guess just give us the big picture, and then we can, hopefully everyone, hopefully, or not everyone, but most of the students probably would have read the 2015 paper, and so we just want to lay the groundwork for that line of inquiry, and then I'm sure they'll have.
Yeah. Again, I know an awful lot to Wendy, who's really has been my true mentor throughout my scientific career, of doing this and getting me involved in that line of research. She had an important clinical question from just understanding menopause and integrated it with the evidence that was available from the preclinical models to formulate the hypothesis. But it's been an interesting story about how that's been evolving, because our focus had been, and our hypothesis had all been formulated around estradiol, estrogens. So with menopause, what happens, of course, is that estrogens go down because the ovaries are no longer secreting estrogen. But you also get an increase in gonadotropins. You get an increase in follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So the premenopausal environment is characterized by high estrogen, low FSH. The postmenopausal environment is characterized by low estrogen, high FSH. And it's not just in the studies around body fat and weight gain and body fat distribution. There's been a lot of emphasis on understanding vascular function, glucose action with estradiol, because these are all things that change as we go through menopause. And all of that work is focused, and also osteoporosis, obviously, as well, because the impact of estrogen on bone. And all that work is focused on estrogen. And in 2017, there was a paper that came out in Nature. It was a couple of different laboratories that did this work. And it was entirely in mice and rats. So it was entirely a preclinical model. But what they presented was evidence that high FSH does the same thing as low estrogen. So now all of a sudden the emphasis is there could be more than one player in this. We've always thought it's just because of low estrogen, if we add back estrogen, that will fix everything. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's more complicated than that. And it appears that FSH, particularly on bone, has big effects. High FSH can basically start to eat away bone in these models. It has an effect on adiposity, but it also had an effect on brown fat. So it's really about the, our thinking now is changing, and it's really about the entire hormonal milieu and how it changes and causes this. So what about men? Why don't we study men and look at this? I would like to. I think we could get there eventually. There's certainly a lot of studies looking at low testosterone from a number of aspects. And we do know that estrogens will increase, they'll stimulate UCP1 production, uncoupling protein in brown fat. That's the very important protein that leads to the uncoupling and the heat production and the massive waste of energy. Whereas testosterone will have the opposite effect. Low testosterone will have a similar effect. So there's reasons to maybe study men. But the thing is that with menopause, you've got an abrupt, not so much abrupt, but you have this transition that occurs over a period of a couple of years where things really change in women. And in men, it's a much longer process. Testosterone declines slowly as men age, so you don't go through the equivalent of menopause. So you don't, and it's a little bit harder to induce these changes in men, but there have been studies similar to what we do. We use a pharmacological approach to block estrogen, ovarian hormones, and there's been similar studies that have been done in men to block testosterone and estrogen production as well, because men have estrogen as well. We convert it in our fat cells. We convert testosterone to estrogen, and it's actually been shown that in men, if you suppress that conversion of testosterone to estrogen, the men will gain central fat the way that women do when they go through menopause. So estrogen is not just important in women; it appears that it's important in men. So that's a really fascinating thing, but it's complicated studies to do. You have to use a couple of different approaches to do it. You have to use an aromatase inhibitor to block that conversion, and you have to block the testosterone in that back. So I think there's room to go into, start to look at male sex hormones in this, but we're kind of focused on the female for now.
And so do you think that kind of, we saw the same kind of obsession with the single hormone happen with leptin, 20, 25 years ago. Do you think, and this question might be a little out there, but do you think that is more due to the reductionist approach that we sometimes take with science, where we're trying to just boil everything down to one cause, as opposed to accepting that it's more complicated than that?
I think the knee-jerk reaction is to definitely do that. Do students know the leptin story?
I don't know. I've kind of gone over very briefly its role, but
I still predict that Friedman will get the Nobel Prize for his work in leptin. I really do, because it was groundbreaking. Because what he showed was that there was a hormone secreted from white fat that could have effects in the brain, throughout the body. And it really changed how we looked at white fat. So it was a paradigm shifting moment when Jeff Friedman did his work. But what was interesting from that is when they found leptin, they knew that in the rodent models where they had leptin deficiency, they gave them leptin back that can make them skinny. And everybody in the field was excited. I was just entering the field at that time. That's all we have to do. We have to give obese people leptin and they'll be skinny and we'll solve the obesity problem. Well, that didn't pan out. And what people learned from that experience is it appears that we have leptin resistance. So you can give leptin back, but if the signaling's not working, it's not going to have any effect. And that appears to be what the case is in humans, because obese humans have very high levels of leptin. It's just not responding the way that we think it is. So, I was going to say that my career has kind of shifted from being an exercise physiologist to an integrative physiologist. And I think this is a great example of why you have to think that way. You have to think about the integrated response throughout the entire body. to understand how these things work. And I think Friedman's work was eye-opening for a number of perspectives. You know, number one, changing how we thought about white fat, but number two, thinking about this integrative approach to how we have to answer these questions, and that it's definitely much more complicated than we think it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's one of the pitfalls that you could conceivably run into, you guys, is that not that there's anything wrong with taking a systems approach, but if you only study the cardiovascular system, you're only looking at one piece of the puzzle. You're not getting the whole picture. And at least kind of from where I sit and where Ed sits, and we're interested more in the whole human, the whole person, the whole organism, as opposed to given systemic responses. Here's a question. Any studies looking at how estrogen loss or other hormones during menopause might affect mental health?
Yeah, so it's really, that's a great question. So in our group, I'm part of Wendy Court's group, which is the IMAGE group. It stands for Investigations in Metabolism, Aging, Gender, and Exercise. And there are several of us who are applying this pharmacological suppression model to look at different questions. Kerry Moreau is looking at suppression of the sex steroids, both in men and women, and how it affects vascular function. Kathleen Gavin, who's a very talented adipocyte biologist, is looking at this really novel precursors to adipocytes and how they're affected by estrogens. We've had groups that have looked at the glucose and insulin response, and now we have an MD who's very interested in the estrogen Alzheimer's link. And so she's performing studies with the suppression models to look at the potential effect of estrogens on cognitive function. And that work is just too early to really do any sharing with. But yeah, there are people that are starting to look at that. I'm blank. I know I just read something recently or saw something recently that was creating a link between estrogen levels and the amyloid plaques that form with Alzheimer's. That estrogen in high estrogen models, you tend to see low amounts of those plaques, and if you knock out estrogen in these preclinical models, there's less of those plaques. So there's definitely a link. It's an area that's understudied. Women are at higher risk for Alzheimer's and dementia than men, so there's obviously a link there. And if you're looking to establish a career, NIH is throwing tons of money at Alzheimer's. So if that's an area that you want to investigate, it could be a very lucrative career in that field.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, not only are women at higher risk, but I don't know if there's evidence to support this, but I want to say that the onset and speed in terms of like the severity of symptoms also seems to be faster in women for Alzheimer's as opposed to men.
I don't know for sure, but I think that's reasonable. I don't know that literature very well. Again, I see occasional presentations and scan a couple papers now and then, but I don't know for sure, but maybe. And it makes sense, because women go through a more abrupt change in their hormonal environment than do males. So it makes sense that that could happen.
Are there any plans to do any of the brain imaging with or without estradiol
Me?
yeah, with Mark's group or whoever?
Yeah. I just reviewed something that's specifically going to be doing that. So somebody on campus is going to be doing that. So I was just looking back because I just got this. So I am co-chair on a committee. It's called the Scientific and Review Committee. And all human protocols that have not been reviewed by NIH and only have like our pilot studies and things like that come through our committee. They go to us first for scientific review, and then they go on to the IRB for ethical review. But we only do that with grants that haven't had a high level review like NIH, just so that there's some scientific review. And I know that there was a protocol, I wasn't assigned to me. I know there was a protocol that was going to be looking at estrogen and brain function, but I don't know details on it.
No, I'm just curious. Yeah. So one of the many other people that Ed collaborates at Colorado and in many other places is his name's Mark. I think, does he go by Mark or does he go by Mark Andre?
He goes by Mark, and sometimes we call him Marc Andre, but it's Marc-Andre Coignet.
And he is I don't know, I guess you could call, what does he consider himself? Neuroscientist or?
Yeah, a bit of a neuroscientist. I mean, his interest is in understanding neuroregulation and how it affects feeding behavior. So they've done an awful lot of work. Like some of his trainees who I co-mentor are doing exercise interventions and looking at the the responses to the hunger and satiety hormones, so GLP-1. I'm blanking, but that's always when that comes up. So, but Mark's also had he's got a grant right now where he's doing it with the VA. And he's doing neuroimaging in older adults as they go through weight loss to see how it affects appetite and hunger control. So it's kind of paradoxical, but in older adults, they already have a suppressed appetite. And there's a concern that with weight loss, they may not have the same appetite regulating responses, and it may actually be bad for them to lose weight. So Mark's doing some neuroimaging in that area, yeah.
Let's see. So coming back to the female sex hormones, then what do you see being kind of the future, or what questions what questions do you think need to be answered about the role that sex hormones play in metabolism?
Well, we definitely still need to learn about cognitive effects. We need to learn about the vascular effects. The evidence is definitely accumulating. There's effects, positive effects. But one of the big questions I think now in the field is, and there's been some evidence coming out about this, is what's called the timing hypothesis. So there's a little background. You students might not be familiar with this, that prior to like mid 2000s, sometime between 2000 and 2010, estrogen-based hormonal therapy was pretty widely prescribed and used. And there was a rather large trial called the Women's Health Initiative, WHI. And in one of the arms of the WHI, they were looking at cardiovascular effects of estrogen add back. And in that study, there was actually a signal that adding back estrogen increased risk for thrombolytic events, and I think there was a composite cardiovascular score. But it was a signal, and it ended up they ended up stopping the trial a little bit early because of it, and also it got a lot of press. And what happened is there was a big shift, whereas estrogen add back in postmenopausal women through estrogen replacement therapy was considered the panacea, and then all of a sudden the numbers plummeted. Physicians were no longer prescribing it because they thought it was too risky. What's come out since then, there's been and a lot of this I think stemmed from some studies in preclinical. That's where a lot of these things come from, and then moved into humans is what's called the timing hypothesis. Whereas if you initiate hormone replacement therapy right after the onset of menopause, there can actually be beneficial effects. But if there's a gap of, say, 10 to 15 years post-menopause, and then hormone replacement therapy is initiated, there could actually be increased risk to that. So there's more data coming out that are supporting the timing hypothesis, and I think we need to understand that a little bit more so that we can safely prescribe hormone replacement therapy for postmenopausal women, because there are a lot of benefits, well past the metabolic effects. A lot of women, as they go through it, and many years after menopause, suffer from the hot flashes and the sleep disturbances. These may all be linked to the cognitive events that occur as well. So understanding this is important to understanding how hormone replacement therapy can be done safely and who it should be done in, right? It may not be for everybody. So I think it's an area that the field, hopefully this all adds to that body of literature. And we also don't know, very limited data. I don't know too much about this, but we don't know much about long-term. Alex, geeking out. I don't think we know enough about long-term. Like, we know that if someone had a gap and you initiated it in their 70s, that might be bad for them. But is it bad for somebody who started in their 50s and went all the way through the 70s? And I don't think we know the answer to that. So there's a lot to be learned in that realm.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because an area that I've gotten interested in the last couple of years, but haven't really put anything out yet is the idea of how some of these medications, not just the sex hormones, but let's throw the sex hormones in there since we're talking about them. But some of the medications out there like metformin, um, antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, we, we don't have a lot of great information on how they affect people long term. And the area that's kind of really interesting to me is if we look at the metformin data um, from there's some data from John Tifolt's lab, but I think there's also other data that shows that in some instances, metformin, which is a very commonly prescribed drug for diabetes, um, it may actually impair adaptations to an aerobic exercise program because of how, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here, Ed, because of how metformin acts at a cellular level. I believe it does something to the mitochondria that may cause a reduced aerobic exercise response. And
Yep.
I think, looking at that with a lot of additional medications is something that has not really been done. We get these RCTs from the pharmaceutical companies, and they show, okay, these people took these pills for 2 years, and only 1 out of 1,000 died, and so they're like, okay, so it's safe. But if a antidepressant drug causes you to gain 10 kilos over the 10 or 15 years you're taking it, is that safe?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I don't know that literature, but you're absolutely right. The metformin does have an adverse effect on mitochondrial function that injures the training response. And as you said that, I was thinking also back to some studies like everybody back in the 90s, everybody thought taking antioxidants supplements was good for you, because you're going to block the free radicals and you're going to prevent aging. And then a couple of papers came out that showed that if you block the free radical response, you can actually hinder the response to training as well. There was a vitamin E trial that did it, and there was another one that had a mix of supplements that showed that there was an effect. So it's like this inverted U shape, right? That too much reactive oxygen species is bad, but you have to have some of it because it's an important signaling moiety. Again, coming back to that integrated response, right? Understanding the integration of this. So the metformin's coming out. Now, I can't remember details, but I kind of remember something with Paul Thompson and statins, something very similar, that statins can have an
I
effect.
think you're right. I went over this because I went over this paper a couple of years ago in one of my classes because there's a couple papers on statins as well causing exercise intolerance.
Yeah.
The,
And one of your students put in the chat something about antidepressives, and I would take it the next step further and go build on what you said. We have very little understanding of these drug-drug interactions, right? So if you're taking metformin and something else, how does that affect? And kind of coming full circle, we were talking about the MotorPack project, which is the molecular transducers of physical activity. One of the dreams about MotorPack is that it will establish the normal response and the molecular pathways to exercise training. And then you can start to do the studies where you have these drugs on the background and look and see how it might affect some of these responses. So that's the work for the next generation of scientists to figure out.
okay. We did have Sebastian. Were you talking about female sex hormones or brown fat, or what specifically were you wanting to know about with the race and ethnicity?
Actually, all of it.
All of
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
absolutely. Race and ethnicity are going to have a difference because we have a different genetic background, and they're definitely going to have a role. But can I say right now about estrogens and race? No, I can't. I just don't think we have enough data. There might be some out there. I know that the SWAN studies, which is studies of women across the nation, which has done extensive characterization and clinical studies of women as they go through the menopause. Obviously, that study, it's huge. There's been literally a couple hundred publications out of it. There has to be data in there on race, but I just don't know it off the top of my head. But yeah, definitely. I just don't know the answer to the question. I just think yes.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And have you? Oh, there we go. Since we were on the subject of estrogen and nutrients, what are the implications of eating soy and estrogen? That's not one I am familiar with at all. So I'll let you.
It increases your estrogen levels.
Yeah. So I don't know much about this, but I remember this coming up in discussion with some of our colleagues in the lab meeting. And basically, to have estrogenic effects, if I'm saying that word correctly, you have to eat a ton of soy for that actually to occur. So yeah, you can eat soy, drink soy, and eat soy protein, but you'd have to eat a lot before you'd have hyperestrogenic effects, is my understanding. So I don't know much about that area, but it is used. I know that it's used, and I don't know this literature. I just have heard it from on occasion that it is often prescribed in postmenopausal women who are having issues with hot flashes and sleep disturbances and things like that. And I think there is some efficacy of that, but I don't know that literature very well. So I don't mind sharing with the group that being in this environment. I've been in clinical studies, different studies along the way, and at 2 different times that I've been in studies, because of what the studies were about, I was told, for a male, you have really high estrogen levels. And I don't know why that is. And my guess is it has to do with aromatase activity and converting testosterone to estrogen. But the more I learn about estrogen and how it protects things, I'm quite all right with the fact that I have rather high levels of estrogen. It probably has helped me be a good endurance athlete along the way.
Probably help with your clear skin too. Very clear skin. Anecdotally, just saying, I'll mute.
Thanks, that's a nice compliment.
Train of thought there. So, right, any kind of more comments, questions, points for discussion on the estrogens or the sex hormones, or?
I mean, unless anybody else has any more questions, but I think it's a wide open field from many aspects, as we've talked about. There's a lot to be learned.
I actually have one more, and this is in regards, I think, really just to every medication that they run trials on. So if, and I don't know this, I guess I'm asking a question. So type 2 diabetes, for instance, I think it predominantly hits Hispanics. Do they test like mostly Hispanics when they test for type 2 diabetes medication? You know what I mean? If there is like a genetic difference or race ethnicity difference, or I think there is.
I think there obviously is. That's been shown many times over that Hispanics are definitely at a higher risk. And especially in the right environment. The Pima Indians are the great example of that. The Pima Indians that live on the other side of the Mexican border are still subsistence farmers, are lean, and they have no diabetes. Move them to America and put them on a reservation, and they become very obese and diabetic. So yeah, there's obviously a genetic contribution. I don't know how those things are determined. I'm sure that the trial sponsors have to consider those factors. And one example I'm thinking about is that with the vaccines for COVID, because we were a site for the Moderna trial. One of my postdocs was actually in the Moderna trial. And the reason that she thinks she got in is because she is of Hispanic descent. She's of Cuban descent. And in the Moderna trial, they intentionally over-enrolled in Hispanic, in African American, and Black populations, because those are the populations that were being disproportionately affected by severe disease with COVID. So I would imagine, I don't do drug trials, but I would imagine that in drug trials, these things have to be considered. But I don't know at what level that's done. Is it up to the study sponsors? I just don't know how that's all determined.
All right, well, keeping this train going, but cognizant of your time. So I kind of gave you the hint for this one, so hopefully you've had some time to kind of reflect on this one. But since you entered the field, and let's just keep it to, I don't know. I mean, we could go metabolism, we could go obesity, either or. But since you've entered the field, what has been kind of the biggest change or paradigm shift, if you will, or dogma challenging revelation? And I know we kind of talked about some.
Yeah. No, I was just entering the field when leptin, the leptin story was really exploding. And I think that was definitely a paradigm changer. And I really think that some of the biggest paradigm changes came when they administered lectin and it didn't have the effects that they thought it would. Because now we weren't just thinking about what was being secreted from fat cells, but why isn't it having an effect? So I think that was a big game changer. I think, from the field that I'm in with understanding the effects of female sex steroids and metabolic outcomes, I think that the WHI results were a game changer because it pushed so many women off estrogen-based hormonal replacement therapy, where it had been very common before that. But it also prompted a lot of research to understand what the effects of estrogen are in postmenopausal women. And I think it actually was part motivation. I mentioned it, the study that they did in men. That study was all about different doses of testosterone and what effects that would have on muscle mass, strength, sexual function, and a few other outcomes. But they added in this arm where they did the aromatase inhibitor. It was in the New England Journal. It was done up at Mass General Hospital. It was a great study. It's huge. It's 300 men that in the study. And they showed that when you suppressed estrogens in men, they gained visceral fat, just the same way that women do. So I think a lot of that particular line of research on the testosterone was all about low T. We hear the ads all the time on low T, but I think they probably got the idea of looking at the estrogens because of some of the work that was being done at WHI. So I think, WHI was eye-opening for a lot of people, but I think it was a game changer to try and understand the impacts of these manipulations in postmenopausal women and men as well. So that was a big one. And I think too that from the brown fat perspective, the advance and the readily available now PET-CT approaches that we have to do some advanced imaging and more carefully studying the metabolism of the tissue has really allowed more investigation that couldn't be done years ago. And so as techniques evolve, it allows the science to advance as well. Those are some things. I'm sure if I sat and 12 more, I'd probably come up with a few more, but those are some things that I think about that stem from our conversation today.
Do you think we've developed a better understanding of how to treat obesity? We're still stuck.
No. No.
Yeah.
The incidence rates show that we absolutely have not. I had this conversation with a friend a couple weeks ago, and I think I would like to see, even though this could potentially put me out of a job or at least change my job, though I might retire before we get to that point. We really need to invest more in implementation science. We know that behavioral lifestyle approaches to managing weight work, but it requires sustained contact to be successful. We just can't have people lose weight and then send them on their way because in our environment, they're just going to gain that weight back. And I guess this is another paradigm shifter. And this is a lot of this came from Jim Hill, is just to start to think about weight loss versus weight loss maintenance as two distinct events. And the NIH is actually funding an endeavor in that area to try and understand weight loss maintenance. But I also think just from a public health perspective that we should be doing more with nutritional education in this country, because a lot of the ills that we have, a lot of the problems we have can be traced back to poor quality diets, consumption of added sugars, processed foods, lack of whole grains, fiber, the phytochemicals that come from vegetables. And I used to teach a class here in the physical therapy program on health promotion, and I would cite some of the literature that showed, that there's the evidence from the physical activity literature that if you move someone from being, completely in the lowest category of physical activity, like being very sedentary, to just the next quartile or quintile, not up to the highest level, but just to the next level, that's where you get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of a health benefit from physical activity. And the same thing is true with nutritional quality. It's when you move people from the lowest level of overall diet quality to just the next level, that's when you see the biggest benefits. So we're not talking about major revampments of individual dietary practices, just some simple elements. And I'd like to see some more emphasis placed on nutritional education to address these things. And I think the realization, I hope, is going to set in because of COVID night. I don't know how many of you saw it, but CNN ran a special on Sunday night where they interviewed the doctors of the COVID response. So they had Fauci, they had Bricks, they had the former CDC director and other people that were involved with the COVID response. And Fauci, for sure, and maybe one other, I was on my Peloton, so I don't remember all the details, but they talked about, underlying all this, why we were hit so bad in this country is the problem of obesity and diabetes. And it's really making it clear how much of a burden this is to continue this. So I hope it's raised to the forefront. So, I think we know enough about behavioral lifestyle approaches. I think we know enough about nutritional science that we could implement some policies to make a difference. But I think it's got to start at a fundamental level with education.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just kind of anecdotally building off of that, and during my time in Kansas City, the number of people that we would get coming through the weight loss program who didn't know how to use anything besides a microwave was quite appalling, to be honest.
Well, we put some nutritional information on food labels, but how many people really read it, and those that do can make any sense out of it, right? We could do better. We could definitely do better than we're doing.
And correct me if I'm wrong, so the 80% of the individuals in the United States that don't meet the ACSM guidelines, so I checked into that percentage and broke it down, and it was like 10% was white, Caucasian, non-Hispanic, European descent, and then the rest were like all minorities. And then like fast forward to all the research I've been reading, it was essentially saying that there's like there's a culture barrier that people of ethnic backgrounds, they just kind of have like it's crazy. Anecdotally, just to sum it up, like my grandma, she will not leave her doctor. And I found out for the first time, it's because she's Filipina and she like trusts her, she speaks Tagalog and stuff. So I just found that really interesting that it ties into like all the rich, and it's been free from 2003 to present day. Everything is saying the same thing: cultural tailoring. It's like Tai Chi, like study Tai Chi, but that's like a huge like exercise for, I think, Chinese. Is that Chinese? Anyway, but yeah.
Tai Chi is Chinese. No, there's definitely cultural factors that have to be considered and are very important. I don't remember seeing data on this. I just have heard it talked about that, particularly in the South, in the Black and African American communities. If you look at the maps, where's our obesity rates the worst? Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, all the way up into Texas and West Virginia. And it predominantly hits the low SES and racial cultures in those societies, in those states. And I've heard it said that in the South, in a lot of the Black communities, African American communities, for women, they view being rather large as a sign of maternal strength. So there's a cultural barrier there. I saw it just came up in the chat room about lack of resources. Absolutely, absolutely. You don't have the resources directed to the communities that are being the worst hit by these. But there are definitely cultural influences and cultural barriers. I'm sure there's cultural barriers about physical activity and exercise as well. Not an area I know well, but there has to be. And so that has to be part of the education approach, right? We have to address some of these cultural barriers to implement it, because those are the communities that are being hit worse by the burden of these chronic diseases, these chronic conditions.
Answer.
I'll also add that if you map the density per capita of McDonald's over the obesity maps in the United States, they tend to coincide.
Oh, I hate McDonald's.
Blame
Oh my
McDonald's
lord.
though, because you got all those fried chicken places in the South too.
That's true. That Kentucky Fried Chicken's good. I kind of want chicken nuggets now. You know what I learned today? So, as Amanda said, socioeconomic barriers, which is lack of resources. So, an interesting thing that I learned in my stats class today was in the military, so let's just say if you're a low socioeconomic ethnic minority individual and you join the military to sort of gain those resources, it doesn't even help. It doesn't even help. It's so interesting that like all the I forgot what she said, but basically she was saying that like all the statistics that they were looking at with barriers, like health barriers, still followed even after individuals joined the military, which, you know, military, you have healthcare and stuff like that. So I thought that was really interesting. It's like you can't win. Can't win.
Well, but I also don't think that the military system is set up to do programming to improve long-term health outcomes in individuals, right? The military is all about optimizing performance while they're in the military. So I don't necessarily think that will translate to the lifelong habits. And this is what I used to talk about in the class I taught on health promotion and to the PT students, is that we really have to think about these things in terms of what's best for what's optimal for our lifespan, our entire life of eating habits. And so, yeah, like a keto diet might be good at helping people lose some weight in the short term, but is a keto diet necessarily good for long-term health? And I, for one, would say no. I would say no.
Shut it.
Because if you're going to be on a keto diet, that's necessarily low in carbohydrate, and a diet that's low in carbohydrate is restricting fruits and vegetables, and that's necessarily going to reduce fiber intake. And one of the strongest relationships between nutrient intake and disease risk is the association between fiber and cancer risk, colorectal cancer, stomach cancers, GI cancers. So this quick fix type mentality of just do this for now and then you don't have to worry about it, it's wrong. And I coming back to your question about the military, I don't think the military is thinking about what this person has to be doing for the next 60 years to stay healthy. They're only worried about when they're in the military. And that's probably a mindset that needs to change. I saw something that came up in the chat that got an report. Portion sizes, absolutely. I have a whole set of slides on portion sizes. I'm old enough to remember when Coke bottles were 8 ounces.
Yeah, I have a slide like that I show in my undergrad class whenever I teach obesity. It shows what the fast food looked like in the 1950s compared to now.
And it's innocuous stuff. It's like bagels, right? If you look at the size of a bagel over 30 to 40 years, it's ridiculous. It's 3 to 4 times bigger than what it used to be. And that's when you just ate a plain bagel. Now, of course, you get all the toppings on it, right? So it's a meal in and of itself. Look at the drinks at Starbucks. What are we up to? Venti, right? Trenta, Venti? I don't know. The size and all the sugar and stuff that they put in it. I don't think most people realize that they're getting half to 2/3 of their calories that they need for the day just from one of those drinks when they put all that stuff in it.
800 calorie frappuccino.
Matt, have you ever looked at the nutritional stuff on the Chipotle burritos?
I think I have, yeah. It's like
They
2,000
can,
calories a burrito, isn't it, or something?
it can be. It can be. When I was training Ironman, I used to wolf one of those down. Not anymore. But it's innocuous. The ways the serving sizes have increased and really led to this. And of course, it's readily available as well. Everywhere we go, there's a candy counter in front of where you shop.
Yeah, and Silvana, you bring up another great point, that coming back, coming back to the food labels, a serving size is different than an entire bag, but some people won't get that. And so they'll
Well, they put it on the bags, but people never stick to it. It's a problem.
Good enough.
Well, it's like the Ben and Jerry's pints, right? I just eat half of it in one night and then eat the other half the next night.
Keep riding that bike, you can do it.
That's the only reason I ride, man. So that I can keep eating like an asshole.
Oh my Lord.
That sounded fun, Mackenzie. I hope you're okay.
Yeah, self-control is hard. It's hard for a lot of people.
And that that opens the can on a much, I mean, just as crazy. That whole.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of, these are all areas of research. I don't know much about these, but there are definitely people who investigate all these areas. There's a metric called restraint and disinhibition that they use in the eating literature. And those that have high levels of restraint and aren't disinhibited tend to control their intake very well. And we've done some studies. It was collaborative stuff I did with a professor from Boulder looking at sleep restriction and how that affected metabolism. We did some studies in our room calorimeter. And I'll never forget that, one of the findings of that study was that when we sleep restricted, even over a period of 5 to 7 days, people would tend to gain weight. But the weight gain was much more dramatic in the men than the women. And I bring this back to restraint because the women knew that they were hungry from the sleep deprivation, but they somehow had the restraint to control themselves and not overeat, as opposed to the evening I went in there and one of the men that was was sleep restricted had a gallon of ice cream and he just had the spoon and was just eating out of it. He had no restraint whatsoever, and it was unconscious. He was just eating it. So yeah, there's a whole body of literature in that area. I don't know those areas very well, but yeah, restraint and disinhibition are very important concepts in regulation and stress, causes dysregulation of all this.
Yeah, there's a whole crazy neuroscience, psychology soup of what regulates our desire to seek out particular nutrients or particular types of food. And coming back to the larger issue, the whole problem now is we're hardwired to find sugar and fat pleasing. And when you put them together, you get this magical, hyper palatable food, and that's why things like candy and chips, and chocolate, and all the good stuff is maybe not so good because it's really easy to eat.
It's addictive, isn't it? That McDonald's puts sugar in their buns.
I don't know. I can't say I'd be surprised if that was the case, but
I thought I heard that at one point.
I believe it.
Enhance the addictive qualities of it.
Yeah, isn't sugar the most addicting drug? Right?
Oh, I don't know.
I don't go that far. Whether or not there's debate in the literature about whether or not food addiction is a real thing, and pretty much the same thing is going for sugar addiction. So food or sugar addiction is not recognized by the psychological community as a diagnosable disease or condition, however you want to phrase it. But there's considerable debate about whether or not food addiction should be included.
I don't think it could be like food addictions. arguable for sure, but sugar addiction, that, I mean, if you cut off sugar cold turkey, you have like withdrawal symptoms, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, you're gonna feel bad, but if you just cut out, if you're just cutting out table sugar, you're not gonna die. Um, Granted, that's not how addictions work. I know,
I know, I was like, oh crap, okay.
but it's there's just a lot of real interesting stuff about the interactions between the brain and how your brain is configured and how it's wired to the the physiology. So like Ed's been involved in some studies comparing obesity prone individuals, so individuals who gain weight very easily, to obesity resistant individuals, so individuals who tend to just remain on the thin side no matter what you throw at them. And
Yeah, that's Dan Bessison's work.
yeah, and they've
They
stuff where they've looked at differences in the brain and differences in the activation of the brain in response to pictures of food. And we've yet to really figure out why, but it seems that people who are more prone to weight gain, they're, at least in the brain and probably other places in the body, they're hardwired differently. Um, and unfortunately it just predisposes them to this vicious cycle.
Dan's got a pretty good longitudinal study going right now on obesity prone versus obesity resistant. So I'd be interested to see what they learned from that over the years. Some of them are being studied in our room calorimeter, and we're also doing the deadly water on them. So that's how I'm involved with it. But that'll be interesting to study. It's a tough phenotype to define, right? And the way they do it is obesity prone is someone who's been obese and lost weight and gained it back, and somebody who is obesity resistant, no first degree relatives that are obese and self-reported that they can eat whatever they want and not gain weight. But that's how they define it. So it's a very tough phenotype to define from a research perspective.
Yeah.
I personally think that those people who are so-called obesity resistant in our environment will be obesity resistant for their lifetime. I had an uncle that was married to my aunt who I remember as a kid, he was a beanpole. He's 6'2", 170 pounds, and I used to watch him just whelp down the cervix. And he would always say, I never gained weight. And he's over 400 pounds now. So I don't think it lasts.
Turn around. Yeesh.
I don't think that lasts.
I'll let you know. My dad turned 65 this year, and he can still fit into clothes he wore in high school and college. So
I'm not quite as old as your dad, but I'm close to that. And I'm basically about the same weight as when I competed in college. So I'm right there too.
You were a good weight in college. I was like, I wrestled at 141 in college and then 125 in high school. Now I don't even know. A lot of weight. I was gonna ask actually about the brown fat. Could you measure it with like a DEXA?
No, it won't show up in a DEXA because DEXA doesn't have the resolution to be able to distinguish. And even with CT, computed tomography, which is just basically intense DEXA, right? It's just an intense X-ray approach. You still can't identify it. That's why we have to combine it with PET, positron emission tomography. So what happens with CT or any X-ray device, it can definitely distinguish compartments that are fat, right? But it can't tell if it's white or brown. And the way we distinguish it as being brown is we use the PET with a radioactive tracer. Most often we use a glucose tracer because when the brown fat is active, it'll take up huge quantities of glucose, whereas white fat won't. So you superimpose the PET image over the CT image. So if it was identified as fat, and then when we cold expose it, took up glucose, then we said that that's brown fat. So it's really hard to identify. We don't have that technique. MR has the promise of looking at some of the fat fractions and being able to do it even without cold exposure, but it's got a long way to go, I think, before we're ready. So we just don't have a good imaging approach. Some people have used thermography, infrared photography to try and get a picture of the body and look at some of the warming. It kind of works, but it's hard to quantify. So from a research perspective, it's not the greatest tool. And I think that one of the problems can be if you're dealing with an obese person, because we've studied some obese people that have pretty high amounts of brown fat. You know, we think that it'd just be the opposite. All obese people have low brown fat. We've seen just the opposite. But that skin temperature might not reflect it because of the insulation. So the thermography might not work as well. So there's a lot of challenges in the brown fat field and trying to quantify it.
Yeah, I was gonna say I knew that there were some labs trying to use thermal cameras and either a cold challenge or something to try to stimulate the bat before they would take a thermal image. But yeah, my read
It's
is that it's just not.
it's kind of a relative thing. You know, it's not really very quantifiable, unfortunately. You can kind of get that skin temperature, but there's a lot of factors with it.
Is there an association of brown fat and more visceral adipose tissue, or really?
Yeah.
Ooh, okay. Because my question came from the Rancho Bernardo study, Dr. Schubert, where they studied Filipinos, African Americans, and white non-Hispanics, and they found that Filipinos had the highest, like crazy, they had like 32% of visceral adipose tissue versus like 8 and 15%. And yeah, I was just wondering, maybe they could have good tissue too, or
Yeah. It's a bit of a mixed literature in the humans, but I would say on balance, and it's always observational. We don't have good intervention data on this, but the type of work we do, we can have. I think we'll have some intervention data. But there are several studies in the literature that show that when you have individuals with high level of brown fat, they'll have better overall metabolic markers. They'll have a better lipid profile. They'll probably have lower triglycerides. They have lower glucose. They might have better insulin sensitivity. They might have lower visceral fat. But it's a bit of a mixed bag in the literature. And again, I'm saying on balance, this is my interpretation of it. But it's also a hard thing to do because of the reasons that I outlined, that it's a tough tissue to measure and quantify. And so some people take their cohorts and they try to define BAT negative versus BAT positive subjects, but we're not even really good at measuring the volume. So how can you distinguish BAT negative and BAT positive? So it's a bit of a mix. The animal data, I think, are pretty convincing that when you have high levels of brown fat activity, it's definitely associated with better metabolic markers. And I think on balance, the human studies are supportive of that, but there's a lot of limitations to it, and you got to take those studies and very cautious in the interpretation. So I guess if I can get on a soapbox for a minute more, Matt, that's another thing, is overinterpretation of results. You know, we all want to think that our research is cutting edge and important, but you have to be very careful about overselling your results. And I used to be a fan of the New York Times science section. I no longer am, because they will take, you know, recently there was a study that was a secondary analysis of another study. So they looked at something the study was never intended to do, and they found a signal, and it got written up, and they made a big deal out of it. And that bothers me, because I talked about this at the beginning when I was talking about chaos in the brickyards. Science is based on a body of evidence. It's never based on a single study. And there have been too many cases of where you see something in a single study that can never be replicated again. And so replication is important, but unfortunately, replication is not rewarded in our field. You can't get funded for doing something that somebody else did. And I think that's a problem. But just in general, the way that science is treated in the media, treat it cautiously. You know, when they write up a story about a study, do they talk about it in relation to what's already known in the field or what's been found previously? Are there other studies that back this up? And then, of course, there's the gold standard of a randomized control trial. If it's just an observational study, it's not going to be the strongest evidence. And I think some of our own scientists are so guilty of this as well, because they see the chance to get in the media and sell their story, and I think they oversell it. And I'm adverse to that. I really have a problem with it. So be skeptical when you read some of these things in the press. My least favorite words in the American or English language is, when I hear on the radio, is either new research shows or a new study shows, because I already know it's going to be BS what follows, and that it's going to be oversold. So learn to think critically and look at things like that, be critical of it, and get the message out too. When people start reading these things and they want to, jump on them and say, hey, this study showed this. Well, it's one study. I can find a study to show you anything you want. Especially when it comes to diet stuff, you can find anything in the literature to support whatever position you want to take on nutrition. But what does the body of literature show? That's what's important, and that's why science is important, and scientists are important. Okay, enough of my soapbox.
That's right. Yeah. So remember, science is based on consensus.
Mm-hmm.
That was a good point.
So we're getting close to our end time, so I'll just give the students one last chance for questions, and then if you have any kind of concluding remarks or advice. So any final questions for Ed? We're coming back from break, so the brains might be a little...
Getting late in the afternoon.
I'm having the same problem, so I'm not sending anybody out, guys.
And we all have Zoom fatigue, right?
Yeah.
I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to y'all today. This has really been fun. I've enjoyed it. I wish I had opportunities like this when I've been a graduate student. It was, being virtual makes it so much easier. Thank you. I really did enjoy it. It was very fun. Yes, you can get in touch if you have questions. I saw that come up. Absolutely.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Heck yeah.
Ed, would you be okay sharing your email, or I can have them email me and then get them in touch with you if they had questions? Or
yeah, either way. Why don't you go through you and then send it to me through you?
Okay. Yeah.
That way I know it won't go to a junk or a spam filter, and I won't overlook it.
Yeah.
So if it comes from you, then I'll know for sure.
Okay, there you go. So if you have additional questions or other things for Ed, send them to me, and we'll get you guys hooked up.
Thanks again, and wish you all the best of luck, not just in your program, but anything beyond that you choose to do. And I mentioned to Svetlana when we talked last week, whatever you do, find your passion. I've really had a lot of fun with what I'm doing right now, and that makes it easy to get up and, walk down the hallway and go to work now, as opposed to getting in a car and going somewhere. But find your passion and follow it.
Yeah, that lines up exactly with what, or pretty closely with what George told us a couple weeks ago. So you're in good company there.
That's interesting to hear. I've never been accused of being in George's circle too many times.
No, he said to have a vocation in addition to a vocation.
Very interested.
Working all the time.
I like great. Breaking Bad.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I talked to the Valana Rasmussen, who was else that I spoke to last week. He didn't show his picture today. But I talk about the importance of separating work from non-work. I've adopted now a philosophy of my emails off at 6 p.m. I'm no longer looking at it in the evening, and I'm not putting it back on until I get up the next morning. And I don't want to be sending out emails to other people. And I think that this 24/7 pervasiveness is not good for us. I really think it affects our ability to decompress, but also think creatively. I'm also now very adverse to social media for the same reason. I think it's nothing more than something that diverts our attention from the things that are really important in life. And I'm very adverse to social media these days. So, okay, I got back on the soapbox a little bit. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. We have somebody in our department who's very much anti-social media and anti-device. Actually, he doesn't even have a cell phone.
I'll keep the cell phone, but I'm away from the social network. And the funny thing is that, I'm sorry, this is running. In my department now, in my division, there's a big push to be out there on Twitter and promoting our science on Twitter. And I don't want to do it.
I understand. I mean, I'm pretty heavily engaged in that. But I definitely understand your reticence because it can get ugly.
All right. Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity to come and
No,
talk to y'all.
we appreciate you coming and spending your time with us. And should let's see.
Oh, I have to share this because I'm a big Wait fan. I just saw somebody that put up there that says, I still don't understand how to use Twitter. I can't remember the guy's name, but he played the pirate. I can't remember the pirate's name. And it's a cult movie. I can't remember the name of it. But anyway, his wife was on with them on NPR on Wait, Don't Tell Me. And apparently they've gotten famous because their son is recording them and putting it on TikTok. And the wife's response about this was, she's like, I'm sorry, I don't understand any of this. And especially TikTok. She says, TikTok makes Twitter look like Shakespeare. I thought that was a great line. Anyway.
Make sure you let us know what your Twitter account name is when you make it.
I had one and I'm not going back on, so I don't know. Thanks again, Matt. It was really good to see you.
We'll catch up at hopefully we'll catch up at a meeting one of these days soon.
ACSM or Obesity Society next year, I hope. So.
All right, sounds good.
Be well, all. Bye.
That guy was so cool.
Well, I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. I am trying to